I'm Ronald Rise, and in addition to being a government affairs consultant for Gunster, I had the opportunity to serve you as a legislator and chairman of the Public Service Commission, and most importantly, the role that I value the most is a husband and a father of two wonderful children. And so in all of my roles, I have been and remain a passionate advocate for education overall and public education. This afternoon, we will hear from a number of distinguished experts and policymakers. First, we will have a panel on school choice. Then we will hear about Pepin Academies from the Executive Director, Dr. Jeffrey Skorousnek, and have a roundtable on workforce development. Both of those portions will be next door in the Grant Ballroom Central. Let me also thank the sponsors of this Education Summit, T. Pepin Distributing. Natalie King is here, thank you. Helios Education Foundation, Charles Hokinson is here somewhere. And the Florida Coalition for Children, Kurt Kelly is here as well. Now, it is my honor to introduce the moderator for the school choice panel, my former esteemed colleague who jokes with me that I always sat in the back and voted against the budget, Representative Kelly.
And thank you, everyone. Let's, first of all, get your Red Bull, and let's get ready for I think, an outstanding opportunity to hear from some national experts and folks that have a real interest in the school choice movement and this arena. We will let them introduce, guys, I'm going to let you introduce yourself when the time comes, and then answer the first question. We'll go through that. If you have a question, or if they say something that's really kind of exciting and you'd like to get it, just let me know. We're going to try to keep this engaged as we go through this process. Well, let me thank you all for being in here. You know, in 2001, I was called by the governor's office, Governor Jeb Bush's office called me. There was an opening on the Marion County School Board. And I was a businessman in the Ocala area, and I was asked would I be interested to serve filling out a term on the Marion County School Board. I want to thank Jeb for that. I will never forgive him for that. But it was, and that's a tough tour of duty, school board work. But when I went up to talk with them, they kind of asked me about my bona fides. Why should we put you on the school board? And I said, well, I come from an education background. My family, I think my grandmother, my great-grandmother, certainly my mother and father were educators. My mother has a PhD from the University of Florida in education. My dad has a master's degree from FAU in education. I have a master's degree from the University of South Florida in education. My wife is at the time, 25 years school teacher teaching 4th grade. We were deeply engaged in public education. I went to public and private schools, and so I have a different perspective. And I said, that's not the reason you ought to look at this. Because I believe in the very nature and the fabric of our nation is an understanding that we must have an educated electorate. We must have an educated citizenry. In fact, Thomas Jefferson says you can't be free and ignorant. And so, understanding of that, if you take a look at even our first vice president and our second president, John Adams, he really believed in education. Now, it certainly didn't look like what it was today, back then, but he certainly believed in it. And he believed that you should have a general understanding of communications, writing, and speaking, and just grammar and so forth. In fact, he actually believed you should have the Latin and Greek etymology. He was a big believer in understanding of being able to communicate like it. Secondly, he believed you should have mathematics and understanding of those areas. He also believed that you should have an understanding of philosophies, both in business philosophies, but also in general philosophy. and particularly what the philosophy is of how we had founded our nation. He also believed that you should have an understanding of good ethics and morals that came from the Bible. That was his statement, that you should get those value systems. All of this makes great citizenry. He also believed in arts and music and performance. He said that's where the innovation and creativity is. And so here's a guy at the beginning saying how important public education is, or how education is in general. Our Constitution closes out the preamble and securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Yes, the very fabric of our nation is founded on this belief system of having a dynamic, maturing, and I believe a universal education process so that we can have an educated and not an ignorant citizenry. I told them that if I get on the school board, I will be for public schools, but I'll also be for private and charter and home and community and vocational. And I began to make a list of them. That's the charge. And that's really part of where we have begun to see, and I knew that Jeb and his team was very much in for that, and was very excited about that. And as I told you, being on the school board was an unbelievable challenge, just because of all the variables you heard a little bit earlier as one of our speakers, as David was talking. So what I want us to do now is open up the conversation around what real education is in the school choice movement. And so with that, let me start. You have an unbelievable panel of both educational leaders and thought leaders. And so I'm going to open up the first question for all of you. The first one is, I want you to introduce yourself. We'll just start here with you, Adam, if you don't mind. And we'll just go ahead. Please tell us your role in this policy space, this school choice policy space, as you introduce yourself. And then as you're doing it, tell us how you see, where are we going to be 5 years from now?
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be here this afternoon. So I am the Executive Director of the Office of Independent Education and Parental Choice. It's the school choice office within the Department of Education. We're a pretty unique division within the department. We're created by law, and we're outside of the kind of K-12 bureaucracy, so allows us to be nimble and quick and respond to needs very quickly. My division is responsible for overseeing, administering, regulating, involvement basically with all of the school choice programs in the state that are not directly administered by school districts. So we really have no role with magnet schools or IB schools, but we have public charter schools. We have 5, now going on 6 scholarship programs that we have some role in. McKay, FTC program, Hope Scholarship, Reading Scholarship. We have the new Family Empowerment Scholarship program as well, and the Gardner Scholarship, which is an education savings account program. We have virtual education, home education, and then Schools of Hope, which is a really exciting, it's not new anymore, 3 years, and in this space, like 3 years is like way so yesterday. So we're moving so quickly. So we oversee and kind of administer those programs. We do a lot of work with parental support. We have a hotline, toll-free school choice hotline. We get 35,000 calls a year from parents trying to kind of navigate the different choice options within their school districts. It's exciting work. So in 5 years, I think we're going to continue to see expanded choice. I think you're going to see continued discussions around kind of competency-based learning approaches as well. I think we're going to have a continuing discussion and refinement of how do we balance choice and transparency and accountability and regulation to get to a place really where I think everybody's end goal is, which is a great school for every kid, like a great option for every student, regardless of where you live, what challenges you may have, that there is a great school choice option for you. That's got to be universal across the state.
Great. David.
So You folks heard my argument at lunchtime. I'm with a think tank in Washington, D.C., the Progressive Policy Institute, that advocates for, we're sort of reform-minded Democrats. We call ourselves radically pragmatic. And my project is trying to nudge more and more cities and school districts down this 21st century path that I described in my talk. So we do workshops in cities around the country. We write and research and publish things, and I'm working on a documentary about New Orleans, because every evening when my wife and I sit in front of the tube, it becomes clearer and clearer to me that what appears on screens in this society has about 1,000 times more impact than what appears in the printed word. So I feel like a dinosaur after a career as a writer. In terms of Florida 5 years from now, I have no idea. I'm from Massachusetts. Our think tank is in DC. I could tell you about those places. But,
Tell us. What do you see?
Well, nationally, we're in a period that's very frustrating for me because the combination of the teachers' unions being totally at war against charters and vouchers, and President Trump and Secretary DeVos being supportive of them, has turned 90% of the Democrats against them. It's like, this is, you know, these ideas that I talked about have always been bipartisan. They were supported by Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and many, many Republican leaders, including, you know, your governors here in Florida. They're not ideological, they're focused on what works, but the current political situation is turning it into a left-right struggle, and charters are expanding more slowly. The growth pattern is slowing down, and we're running into political obstacles in states in which teachers' unions have a lot of political power, which they do in states like Massachusetts. It's different in Florida and Texas. So I see some exciting things going on in Florida, Texas, Louisiana. Not so much in a lot of other states. So I don't know. I'm hoping we get past this Trump era and the politics can open up a little again and we can continue to make progress.
Thank you. Erica.
I'm Erica Donalds. I am a mom, first of all. I have 3 boys, ages 15, 11, and 7, and I blame them for getting me into this. What started as a problem for just one of my 3 kids, that my local public school was not meeting his needs, turned into kind of a life mission for me, for all of the children that are like my son and the families that were like me at the time that didn't have choice options. I spent the first half of my career in financial services, the last of which I was the CFO and managing director of an investment management firm, and got the itch to run for school board. So like Kurt, I am a school board survivor here in Florida. I spent 1 term on the school board and discovered that that was not the way to accomplish the goal of universal school choice for every family and a high quality option for every child that meets their unique needs. But that doing that would require an increase in competition, such as charter schools and legislative changes. So I decided to change careers and spend about half my time now helping to start up charter schools as a manager of kind of the business side of things, project management, finance, compliance, and taking care of that side of the business side of charter schools. And the other half of my time as the chairman of an organization called the School Choice Movement, which you've called out a couple times, so thank you. And we basically advocate at the legislative level for expansion of all types of school choice options. We saw a need for kind of an umbrella where we have a lot of options in Florida and a lot of different silos kind of fighting for whether it's charter schools or scholarships or virtual, but really not one organization that is necessarily advocating for all of those moving toward that ultimate goal of universal choice for every family. So that is my ultimate goal. So in the next 5 years, I hope to see some breaking down of the barriers to entry when it comes to starting choice schools in Florida. I know David referred to it being better in Florida than in other states where the teachers union might be stronger, but the obstructionism to opening choice schools here has definitely ramped up, as we've seen in Leon County, where the school district unlawfully rejected schools like Pepin Academy and said that they couldn't come there, and then they didn't ultimately open. So breaking down some of the obstructionism for both charter schools and schools that accept scholarships, seeing an expansion of the scholarship programs, whether it be by increasing the income levels or by geography, and allowing those, what I call gap families, who don't make enough to afford private education, but also don't make little enough to qualify for scholarships, and trying to cover those gap families. And then finally, accountability through transparency. I think we have a wonderful accountability environment in Florida thus far, but we can evolve that accountability to where parents have the information they need to decide what they want to hold schools accountable for. And those metrics may be different than what the state says that they should be caring about the most.
I just want to take that one point. You just mentioned accountability, and you just sort of differentiated between the state's accountability measurements and parents and others. Articulate that just for a second.
So my term for it is accountability through transparency. I think what we have right now is the state telling parents what they should care about when it comes to their type of school or the performance of the school that their child goes to. And we really don't provide a lot of information that parents do care about, such as teacher turnover or teacher tenure, or how long has the principal been there, what has their experience been, their attendance rates, things that parents might be looking at that would make them make a decision about a school, not necessarily only tied to test scores. Not saying that parents certainly want to know that their children are learning and that they're going to be proficient, but allow parents to weigh what's most important to them. Civic education and things like metrics like that, we have some of that, but ultimately if we have an environment where parents can vote with their feet, that competition is going to raise all votes, and the transparency and allowing the market to work truly through freedom of information and choice is ultimately where I'd like to see us.
Okay. John, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is John Kirkley, and I'm a proud Tax Watch member. I'm also the chairman of a nonprofit called Step Up for Students, which administers several scholarship programs for the state. One is for low-income kids that's funded through companies make a donation and they get a 100% tax credit for doing so, and then Step Up uses that money to fund scholarships for very low-income families to go to private school of their choice. We also administer, it was mentioned, the Gardner Scholarship. This is a very innovative program created by the state where the state puts $10,000 into an account for a special needs student, and then it operates like a health savings account where the parent can use it, yes, for tuition, but also for tutoring or therapies or home instructional materials, and basically customize their child's education. We also administer a reading scholarship for public school kids who are behind in reading for supplemental reading services, and a couple other programs. It's totally separate from that 501c3. I'm also co-chairman of a political entity that tries to elect legislators to the Florida State Legislature who support parental choice in education in both parties. And we are now one of the more active players in state politics, really to the equal of the teachers union. And then finally, I'm the vice chairman of a national group that tries to pass school choice laws across the country, and also elect the people that will pass them and implement those laws as well. Where will we be in 5 years? I don't know, but I'd like to take you back 20 or so. Florida, and a lot of you know this, but I think the facts are important. In the late 90s, Florida was not in great shape when it came to public education. There's really only one test that all kids take in all states. Like the Florida State Assessment is different than the Massachusetts State Assessment or Mississippi. But there is one test, it's called the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's given to kids in every state in 4th grade and 8th grade. 20 years ago, there was only 40 states that gave that test. Florida was 38th. Not good. Last year, it's good every 2 years. Last year, Florida was number 4. And when you adjust for demographics, particularly income, Florida was number 1 in the country. And when I say adjust for demographics, the states that were above us were much higher income kids, basically, much higher income families. That's an incredible achievement in the last 20 years. Now why? What happened? 2 things. Regulatory accountability, as David said and described, and market accountability. When Jeb Bush was elected in 1998, he ran on this. He ran on a platform of K-12 improvement. And he had a very extensive regulatory accountability program. It involved things like raising standards, more transparency, holding kids back going on from 3rd grade if they couldn't read, grading schools. All that is regulatory accountability. Rules or laws that force change, or try to force change. But he also ushered in a period of more market accountability, parents choosing. And people really don't have a full comprehension, I think, of how much Florida has moved towards what I would call a new definition of public education. The old definition was raise taxpayer dollars, give every penny to the school districts. School districts run all the schools, as David said, in a fairly uniform manner, and they assign kids by zip code. That was public education 25 years ago in Florida. We have moved more towards a new definition, which is raising taxpayer dollars to educate kids, but then empowering parents to direct those dollars to different providers and even different delivery methods that best suit their individual children's learning needs. And what's interesting now is parents are even combining different providers and delivery methods at the same time in Florida with taxpayer dollars. We have 2.8 million kids that are funded by the taxpayers in the K-12 years in Florida, 2.8 million. Now in our state, over 30% do not attend their zoned district school. And I wish you had done a chapter on Miami. So I loved it. You got to read his book because he goes really into detail on New Orleans, Indianapolis, DC, and you got to read the stories to understand how hard this is. But in your next book, you got to write about Miami. Okay, Miami-Dade County is the 4th largest district in the country. 350,000 kids in that district are educated by the taxpayers. Would you believe that over 70% of those kids do not attend their zone district school? The biggest percentage go to magnet schools, which are schools of choice run by the district. They've created over 100 of them. And some of them are the best high schools in the country. There's also 64,000 kids at 134 charter schools. But there are 30,000 low-income kids going to 441 private schools in Dade County on our scholarship. And then there's about 5,000 kids who are special needs kids going to private schools, 250 of them on the Gardner program, okay? Miami-Dade is the freest market for K-12 education in the country. And it's also the best performing large urban district in the country. And the beauty of this is that the superintendent embraces choice. Alberto Carvalho, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for. Let me give you some direct quotes from him. Choice is a wave. I choose to ride it, not be crushed by it. Children are not widgets, and schools cannot be factories of knowledge. Carvalho actually gave free space to Kip in an elementary school in Liberty City, very poor part of Miami. And I believe one of the reasons he does this and he has this attitude is because, well, again, quote from him, even low-income parents are starting to have choice. We have to give choices to them that they're going to want. Okay? So the way Florida is different than the places, well, not Indianapolis, because they also have private school choice. We, in our state, I think one of the reasons we've done so well over the last 20 years is we are giving all possible options to parents, not restricting some. And what I discovered when I got in this movement, it was shocking. I was a public school kid. I went to Fort Lauderdale High School, down the road, Fort Lauderdale. There was a huge, even before these choice programs existed, there was this huge inventory of private, mostly faith-based schools in low-income areas. And the reason they existed is because parents were desperate. And they needed an alternative. And so I strongly believe that all options need to be on the table because that will provide more market accountability. Now, there has to be, maybe we can discuss this further, there has to be regulatory accountability also, but it's a continuum. And maybe we can discuss that as a further question.
Yeah, and I will, first of all, while you've heard this, just an opening question, any comments, statements, anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Karen? No. Okay. You guys have any questions among each other? Need to ask one another. So that doesn't make any sense whatsoever, Erica. What are you talking about? Nothing like that? Well, let me go to the second question, and it's kind of be the next iteration, and David, when we get to you, I'm going to ask you to give us some examples from other states. But the question will be, where have we got it right? Now, you kind of answered that, but where have we got it right on school choice, and where are some other areas that we can significantly improve? So let's kind of go, in fact, I'll start with Erica, if you don't mind, and then we'll come back this way and you'll finish up.
My favorite school choice program in Florida is the Gardner Scholarship. And not because it's for special needs students, but because it's customizable by the parent in a way that I think is the future of education funding in our state, hopefully in the country eventually. But I think the Gardner Scholarship is and should be a model. So the Gardner Scholarship is an ESA, an education savings account. And unlike some of the other scholarship programs, a parent doesn't have to take that entire amount and use it for private school tuition. They can use part of it for tuition, then they can use another part for tutoring or therapy or curriculum materials that they're going to use at home or software. So they have a myriad of options, and Step Up has put together a wonderful software that helps parents just online select the things that they want to build their students' customized academic experience using that scholarship money. And so imagine if every parent could take the pot of money and say, I want them to take math at the high school down the street, but then I want them to take virtual history and actually need them to have a private tutor for reading because they really need a lot of help with that. So I'm going to put a bigger chunk of that money into private tutoring for reading. And then history, I'm just going to get those materials myself and I'm going to do that with them over the summer. And just combine all of those things to what that parent believes is the perfect academic experience for that individual child. It actually gives me chills to think of parents being so empowered and how much more involved and invested that parents would be in their children's education if they were the ones responsible for customizing it. So to me, the Gardner Scholarship is really the gold standard, and I would love to see that model expanded to all types of students because every single student needs an IEP, an individual education plan, whether they are mainstream or they have a diagnosed special need.
Awesome. Now, I'm going to skip you, David. I'm going to come to Adam next, and then we'll come back. We'll get you last.
I thought I had a couple more minutes to prepare.
That's right.
So where we got it right, I think, so the school choices existed forever, right? So it's been families like mine that have always been able to choose because I can afford to buy the house in the zone that has a school that I think is going to work well for my kids. So this idea of choice being new is not really. So I think where Florida's gotten it right is to focus on those communities and families that historically have been unable to access choice due to their economic circumstances. So with FTC with focusing on low-income students, Gardner focusing on a population of kids that are not maybe particularly being served well. I think that's where we have gotten it right. And I think with the charter school movement in Florida, I think you see a continued evolution of that even towards trying to really ensure that we're putting or helping support schools in communities where choice is needed the most. I think Florida has done that really well. I think that where we have to continue to work and focus is find that balance, I think, that both Erica and John talked about, with the balance between regulatory and market accountability, and making sure that we don't lose sight of the fact or the reality that there are families who will need additional support in really understanding what those things are that are important for their kids and being able to get access to that information, making really well-informed decisions. So I think we got to continue to focus on transparency and making sure that families have access to timely, meaningful, accurate information that they can use to make those choices, and at the same time find the balance with that regulatory accountability also.
John?
I think what we've done right in Florida, and obviously I'm not objective, but we empowered low-income parents to be able to choose from the schools that already existed in their communities, these faith-based schools that were just so prevalent that I had no idea were there. I mean, we have 1,800 private schools that serve kids on the tax credit scholarship program across the state. And as I said, 441 just in Dade alone. And so, how should I put this? K-12 education is a $24 billion business in Florida per year, okay? That's big. And if I had a monopoly on $24 billion, I wouldn't give it up easily. So when we talk about changing things, it's really hard because politics are involved. And so by putting these private faith-based schools on the table, not only did it help families, and by the way, just a quick fact, the Urban Institute just came out with a study this year, and they compared the kids on the tax credit scholarship program, which, by the way, the average household income of the families is $25,000 for a household of 4. 75% of minorities, and 60% from single-parent homes. And they are the worst performers when they leave the public schools. The Urban Institute came out with a study that showed that they go to college at a 40% greater rate than their peers. And they finish, more importantly, they finish college at a 20% greater rate than their peers. Now, if I came to you as a legislator and said, hey, I have a program that's going to produce those results, you'd probably say, well, how much more do we have to spend to make that happen? Well, we spend less than 60% per kid than the public school districts do. So it's working for the families. That's the most important thing. But it also gave us, in the school choice movement, an incredible asset, which was really, really two things. Parents that were in the districts of the people that would normally oppose choice programs. I mean, the way this works is the union gives a lot of money to legislators, and then they oppose the programs, even if their own constituents like them. But if the constituents are educated and organized and connected to their legislators, that makes it a lot more difficult for them. And then second, a lot of these schools, being faith-based, are connected to churches that are pillars in the low-income and minority communities. The ministers are often very influential, even kingmakers, in democratic politics, particularly urban politics. So they get educated or organized and connected to their legislators. And just as an example of how they can be organized and motivated, in 2014, the teachers union filed a lawsuit to shut down this scholarship program. And at the time, we had 80,000 poor kids on the program. And they claimed it was unconstitutional, and they wanted to evict 80,000 poor kids from their schools. And within a month, we had one coalition of over 100 African-American ministers, prominent all around the state, denouncing the lawsuit, and a separate coalition of over 100 Hispanic ministers doing the same. And we called on them all to come to Tallahassee, and over 10,000 people came to Tallahassee to protest this lawsuit, led by MLK III, the day after his father's holiday. And I read in your book that in New Orleans, I think you said over 40% of the African American women didn't support charters or choice. And one of the reasons for that was they saw the people that didn't look like them that were in charge, right? And so
I think the bigger reason was that the old district, when it went bankrupt after
lost a lot
Katrina,
of jobs.
laid off 7,500 people,
Yeah.
and 70% of them were African American.
Yeah.
And so it kind of decimated the African American middle class.
Yeah. We had an interesting phenomenon here in last fall. Andrew Gillum, very strong candidate for governor, very attractive candidate, said that he wanted to end this program, bring the tax credit and scholarship program to a conclusion. Those were his exact words. Candidate DeSantis was very much in favor of it. CNN exit poll showed that DeSantis got 18% of African American women's vote.
And DeSantis credits his victory to this issue singularly. Now, he had to win everything else, but he said because he got the African American women mothers vote, in many of these cases, I've heard his consultants say this is what he wants. Which is really an interesting dynamic. Now you're starting to get into the politics world of it, which is an interesting dynamic. We've been talking about Florida here particularly. Give us sort of a feeling from a national perspective. What are you seeing that's done right, and what can Florida learn from some of the ones that are doing it right?
Well, first of all, Florida has done a whole lot right. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. And I know this NAEP data that John was talking about, and I want to describe it in a slightly different way to bring home how really dramatic it is. 20 years ago, the average kid in Florida was testing at a certain level. Today, they're testing, and this is a reliable test. There's no test prep for it, so it's considered the most reliable test there is. Now they're testing at a level that's 20 plus points above, depending on the grade 4 English math, grade 8 English math. There's 4 categories, but it's in the 20s, right? Well, 10 points is considered a whole grade level, a whole year of advance. So if your average kid advanced more than 20 points, that means that 20 years ago, they were testing at the 4th grade level, now they're testing at the 6th grade level or above. It's phenomenal. So, I think Florida has proven that choice and competition and school autonomy and accountability work. I'm going to just, in terms of what could be strengthened, I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier in response to a question. Your charter authorizing in some cities is weak because the districts do it and they're preoccupied with operating schools. And I would recommend that in those districts where they do a lousy job, which means they allow really substandard schools to go on and on and on and on, just as in the district system happens. That's not supposed to happen in the charter system. So if it does, I think the state should then impose a dedicated authorizer for that district. I think it all the charters would be under that body.
Adam, isn't it true that if the charter gets an F 2 years in a row, that has to be, by law, it has to be shut down?
Correct. So we have default closure, 2 Fs, you have to be closed. Where there's a gap are ungraded schools or alternative schools or the school that's D, F, D, D, F, D, F, D, D, F, that kind of pattern where there's not an automatic closure and you have, for one reason or another, indecision at the authorizer level to go ahead and close that school down.
How long has the automatic closure been?
2011 was the first year that it passed, and we've had about 25 or 30 schools that have been closed under that.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. That's a good thing, but it's still, those lines tend to be drawn, of course, fairly low. And the data nationally says if you have good authorizing and tough accountability and your weak schools are closed, your charter sector is going to be way better than if you don't do that. In terms of learning from other states, I would just suggest one thing, which is the state of Texas. Now, the Texas Education Agency and the legislature have put in place both a carrot and a stick to move districts toward partnering with nonprofits to turn around failing schools. So the stick is, if your school is failing for 4 or 5 years in a row, I think it's 5, gets an F in the state accountability system, the state can either take over the school, close the school, or take over your school board. They can appoint a new school board. So that's the stick. The carrot is if you take one of those failing schools and you partner with a nonprofit, which could be a charter operator, it could be a university, it could be another body, to basically turn it around, then you get another 2 years on the accountability clock. And you get more than $1,000 per child for a period of years to help with that turnaround, which is an attractive carrot. And so the state is incenting districts to go out there and with their worst schools, partner with nonprofits, including charter operators, to turn them around. And places like San Antonio are going gangbusters with it. Midland, Texas, Fort Worth, there's about a dozen fairly big districts that are taking this quite seriously, and it seems pretty effective to me. We don't have the student outcomes from it yet because it's only a few years old, but it's effective in changing district behavior, and frankly, that's the hardest thing here. The hardest thing here is the nature of elected school boards. In elections, when elections have 10% turnout, and the teachers' associations get everybody to vote and fund candidates, it's really hard to get an elected school board to do bold things.
Quickly though, I want you just to answer this question. You don't have to answer it, David. In Florida, best school district in your opinion, and just say why.
Here, John.
I think I already said it.
Yeah, you did. Good. Yeah.
Miami-Dade.
I think it's Miami-Dade.
Just
because it is, think about this. There are over 100 languages spoken in the Miami-Dade public schools.
Wow. Yep.
And if you drive from Coral Gables to Overtown, you see incredible economic diversity as well. To produce the results that they have in that district, given that level of diversity, with half of the spending level of New York City, less than half, is phenomenal. Now, I have admiration for other districts too, like my own in Hillsborough and others, but that's incredible. That's deserving of the book. But again, I think it's because of three things. The things that the Governor Bush and the legislature put in place, the regulatory accountability, but also the market accountability that exists to a tremendous degree, more than any other district in the country, large or small. And the enlightened attitude of the superintendent cleared out a huge part of the district headquarters with people he knew weren't helping kids learn. And then he started his own magnet school in that space called iPrep, which is where the kids learn like on their own with a computer, but then in collaborative groups. And the guy's the principal, full-time principal of the school. I don't know how he does it. So leadership, but also great regulatory accountability, market accountability, best district in the country.
Erica?
I'll agree with Miami-Dade simply because, as well, the results and the amount of choice that students have. But if you don't mind, Kurt, I do want to just comment quick on the turnaround program that he mentioned in Texas, because Florida does have a similar program, and I think it's actually, in policy, even more rigorous than that, because districts are required for those failing schools, and Adam can be more specific than me on this, to either do a district-run turnaround, although that's much more restricted now, or partner with an outside organization to help turn around the schools. In previous administrations, the state and the state board and the State Department of Education wasn't as aggressive as we would like to see them when those superintendents came with their sob stories about why they couldn't turn the school around for multiple years, thankfully we have a new Commissioner of Education, Richard Corcoran, who, as he demonstrated yesterday, is going to be much more aggressive, and we hope the state is going to take their responsibility to push on these districts and force the issue more aggressively going forward to get those schools turned around more quickly. But we do in policy have it. It was a matter of the state board and the state Department of Education pushing and not giving that pass over and over again to the districts. And maybe Adam wants to touch on that as well.
I was going to give you a pass if you had to, but you could go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it was a combination, so previous, back a couple of years prior, our whole accountability structure really was modeled after NCLB, and NCLB, of course, you had multiple options for turnaround until you kind of had to either close or bring in a charter operator. So you had district managed, and then you had external operator or hybrid. So you could have 8 years, 9 years of really failing grades before you had to actually make a big, bold change. That law in Florida was changed a couple of years ago, so where now school districts, if you get 2 Ds or an F, you have district managed turnaround for 2 years and that's it. And if you can't fix it in that point, you then have either bring in somebody else to run the school, turn it over to a charter, or close it down. And that combined with the leadership of Commissioner Corcoran, who is really going to hold districts accountable for performance and make sure that they do whatever is necessary in order to turn those schools around. I think you're going to see it's going to be a bit of a different tone, which I think we saw yesterday at the state board meeting.
Great. Let's go to the audience. Representative Brzee.
Thank you, and I appreciate all the comments. So I'm going to give a preamble just to provide context for my question. Never been a student of public schools, right? Always gone to private schools, parochial schools, family choice, right? My children go to parochial schools, and so that's a choice that I've made, my family has made, and we make the investment, and we understand that there's dollars parked within the school system that then goes to support somebody else who may not have the same capability financially that my family does. When I was a legislator, as a Democrat, I supported school choice, got threatened to have opponents and so forth, but my constituency basically said, look, we believe in choice, and we're going to support what makes sense for our communities. So my question with the notion of the Gardner Scholarship and that kind of model, where you would take whatever that number is, right? Whether it's the number that is assigned in FEFP every year so that each family can sort of take that and go to wherever they want to go. How would that work if that were to happen? This is for Erica. If that were to happen, how do we sustain a public school model that then has everyone pretty much with the option or the ability to take those dollars with them every single year? And how do we sustain making the schools better? Understanding that no matter how much choice we put on the table, most of the children will still be educated in public schools. And then how do we sustain a model that says, well, I may do English at this school, do science there, and so forth, and sustain the infrastructure necessary to support the system.
Hang on, so that's the question leads us right to this next question. So infuse this in this. Where is K-12 public schools going? What role do you see us, as he's just identifying it there? Let's take a look at, so this $24 billion animal that's out there that has the schools that we all went to, by the way, well, most of us, and what's going to happen with them? Because that's going to be the argument on the House floor, Senate floor.
So my question, in response to your question, is what are we gonna do with all the Blockbuster video stores? I mean, we have all these stores and all these innovative things are trying to come in and provided by internet and by mail, and if people are using those, then what are we gonna do with the infrastructure that Blockbuster has invested in all these physical stores? You do what every other industry does when the market and the demand changes and innovation occurs. You have to innovate along with the times. Look at every other industry and the innovations that are the capabilities of innovation over time and how the marketplace forces adjustment over time. Uber, the taxi cabs. I mean, we can think of so many other industries where what used to be 20, 50 years, you couldn't even imagine the structure that we have today. And yes, it's not the same as borrowing videos, but education is a service industry, and it can operate as an industry if we allow it to. I come from the business world. I don't come from a background of the education bureaucracy. So I do have an out-of-the-box mindset. I look at it from the outside in as a business person, as an investment, and someone who's been in investments and say, why wouldn't you be innovating? Why wouldn't you be doing that already? Why, when you see the way that this is going, why aren't you, like Miami-Dade, already making those adjustments to go with the market and the direction that the demand is going? It's absolutely possible. We are actually the minority around the world in the way that we fund education and having the majority of our students educated by government-run schools. Other countries have government-funded schools, but not government-run schools for the most part. My husband just got back from Israel, and they were in a school, and the people in Israel almost couldn't even understand why we do it the way we do it, because it's so unusual that you have government-run schools instead of allowing the parents to select this type of school, even parochial schools, religious schools, with the government funding. So I think we are kind of in our little bubble mindset of what we do in America and what's been done for a long time, and it's really difficult, as I have come to understand in the education world, to get out of that. But the market does it when you allow it to. In Florida, unfortunately, our Constitution especially is very restrictive in protecting the monopoly, but if you look at other places where it is not as restrictive, and certainly in other countries, you see where this innovation is able to take place. And yes, it is going to require closing down school buildings, which is so scary to people. Oh my gosh, we're not going to have this building that has been there for 50, 60, 70 years. Yeah, no, but the children aren't getting educated well there, and the parents don't want what they're offering. So why would we keep it open simply because it's a building in a community? We need to educate the kids and provide diverse learning opportunities. So I just don't think in that same mindset. I think that the free market is very powerful when given an opportunity.
Sir, can I just, real quickly, I think, so I grew up in Miami-Dade. I served in the legislature out of Miami-Dade, and the reason why the Miami-Dade model works is because it wasn't an us versus them. And I think when we sort of frame it as an us versus them, then we create a situation that doesn't make sense, right? So,
Who's the us and who's the them?
I'm getting there. I think public schools serve a tremendous purpose for the broad swath of our community, all right? And when we sort of blanket say that most public schools are not performing, we create a debt. Versus saying, let's create an integrated model that supports all families, all of their choice options that are currently available, and we can move the model to whatever we can view in the future. What I was interested in hearing was, what are some of those literal steps that transition us from where we are today to what they will look like 10 years or 15 years or 5 years down the line, for our kids and our families, and how that transition works from a dollar perspective.
Yeah, this actually relates to what David said, because he was right. Everybody's right. Yeah. Things are so polarized now. He said this at lunch, that you cannot give the opposition to choice and innovation and reform an easy club to beat you over the head with. Representative is exactly right. And I bet you most of you in this room did not know how much we've improved over the last 20 years. That probably shocked you. And the reason I know that is because I did a poll a couple months ago, and I asked 2 questions. Do you think public school, district schools have gotten better, worse, or stayed the same over the last 20 years? 80% said they got worse. Then I asked a question, what do you think we spend per kid, per student in the Florida public schools? I gave 3 ranges. Less than $5,000, between $5,000 and $10,000, or over $10,000. 80% said less than $10,000. 50% said less than $5,000. The number is $13,000. Then I asked them, what should we spend? And most people said between 5 and 10. So if you think about that, everybody thinks we spend too little, but the amount they think we should spend is more than they think should be spent. I mean, why is this? Why is this? Where do people get their information about public education, public schools? Newspapers, TV stations, media. Every time I read an article about public education, at least in our state, it talks about how the schools are starved, they're underperforming, and choice is ruining the schools. So we have a real challenge in terms of how to get this done. So that's the challenge. How do you do it? One of the more interesting things that I've ever experienced was when those 10,000 people were marching up the street in Tallahassee, led by MLK III, and by the way, 80% of those families were of color. All these reporters rushed out from the Capitol to cover whatever it was that was happening. And I was right there and I watched them. And when they first arrived, you could tell they were like excited, positive. Ooh, what is this? I'm with this. And then somebody said, oh, this is a voucher rally. Everything changed. Somehow we have to make this about social justice. We have to make it about what's right and fair for those who are underprivileged, in my opinion, who are underprivileged. Because frankly, the biggest challenge we have are with those who have. The state representative who represents me, I live in probably the most affluent area of Tampa. She called me last summer, as I told you, I'm involved in politics, and she said, John, I need help. I'm getting killed out here. I said, what are you talking about? She said, all these soccer moms, everywhere I go, they're yelling at me because charters and vouchers are draining money from their public schools. And I said, where do they go? Well, they go to the elementary, middle, and high schools where you have to buy $1 million home to be zoned for that school. Their schools are fine, but they're convinced that choice is killing them. So we have a real challenge.
I want to get to the very, very important philosophical issue at the root here that you've raised, public versus market. And I want to respectfully disagree with Erica. I don't support turning education over to the market. Because you've heard me, you know that I love market principles, competition, autonomy. I mean, free markets, as you said, are incredibly powerful. But there's a reason that education is a, quote, public good, as the economists would say. And I want to explain, there are a number of reasons. And that puts some limits on how far I think we should go in a market direction. And to get to the punchline, I believe that we should carefully structure a market for public education that preserves equal opportunity for every child, but also competition, choice, and the best chance to get a good school for every child. So why don't I think that just turning over the market would be a good idea? First of all, public education plays more roles than just educating kids. It also socializes kids. We are a multiracial, multicultural democracy. We're one of the first ones on earth. And I grew up taking all of that for granted. But watching this last presidential election and watching the current administration, I've quit taking it for granted. It's difficult, and we could fail. We are experiencing a lot of tensions around race and ethnicity in this country right now. We have a president who's stirring up his base in opposition to Hispanic folks. I grew up going to public schools, and the junior high and high school I went to were in San Jose, California. Big schools, 500 per grade level. A real mixture of white and Hispanic and Asian kids, and just a sprinkling of black kids. A real mixture of working class and middle class. And we all rubbed elbows and got to know each other and went to class together and played sports together. And I think it was a really valuable experience. And I think if we're going to have a multicultural, multiracial society that works, we need more and more of those kids having those experiences. The other big thing is we're a society where inequality is just increasing incredibly rapidly. And it's a huge problem, and it's putting a great strain on our society. But public schools are one place where children theoretically have equal opportunity. You know, if you go to a public school like I went to, kids from different socioeconomic and racial backgrounds get thrown together and have pretty equal opportunity. Now, I realize the whole system isn't like that. We have a system that's really quite stratified by class and race. But do we want to make it more like that or less like that? I desperately want to make it less like that. Okay, so we could design a voucher program, a scholarship program that created equal opportunity. It would mean that if the voucher was worth $13,000, or let's say $15,000 for a high school, $13,000 for a middle school, and $9,000 or $11,000 for an elementary school, because they cost different things. And you couldn't add to the voucher your own money. And we regulated that market so that we made sure that schools were quality, and if they weren't, they went away. Then that would be a great system. I'd be for that system. But I don't believe that in American politics we can do that. I don't think we can say to parents and win in a legislature, you can't spend a dime more than your public money on your child's education. If you want to spend a dime more, yeah, it has to all be your money. I think we'd lose that battle. So I think then we would get to a system where people who love their children would spend what they could to educate their children. I'd spend, you know, in Massachusetts, a good private school's $40,000 a year. I don't know if I can afford that, but you know, I do my best. So we'd have $40,000 a year schools, we'd have $30,000 a year schools, we'd have $20,000 a year schools, and we'd have $10,000 a year schools. And the market for education over time, this would take 10 or 20 years.
No, David, it already exists.
Well, it does.
People-
But it would be worse.
People
It would be
spend
more
$1 million
like-
for a
Just
house.
let me finish.
They spend $2 million for a house. They spend $500,000 for a
Yeah,
house.
I agree.
That's how it works. So what you're describing, the
I-
stratification already exists.
I agree.
It
But,
just exists through the purchase of a home
We
with
can-
a school that fits.
but we can design a system and structure it to achieve our public goals that makes it less like that rather than more like that. And a pure voucher system would make it more like that. Now, we can create public school districts in which schools kind of operate like private schools. They have that kind of autonomy, but there's equal opportunity for each child, and we're trying to make sure we have quality schools in every neighborhood. And I think that that's the route that we should take. And I really worry that I support the voucher programs in Florida now because they're for low-income kids. I worry that over time, and I know that the leaders, some leaders of the Republican Party would like vouchers for everybody, and that's where they'd like to go. And I worry that over time that's where we'll get, and that will really undermine equal opportunity in this
John, I
society.
know you have a response, and by the way, thank you, David, for breaking up the kumbaya.
Let me say a couple things. Public schools today are more segregated than they've ever been. You know, if you go to Baltimore,
That's not true.
oh, it is
Before
absolutely-
Brown versus Board of Education,
Okay.
they're more segregated than they were when we had forced busing.
Yes.
That's true,
Yes.
but they're not more
Yeah, I
segregated than they've
grant you
ever been.
that pre-Brown, correct. But if you want to see segregated public schools, you know, go to an urban school district. You won't see a white kid in Baltimore public schools. Okay? So something's wrong there. And as I said, there is not equal economic opportunity. People buy homes because, what's the number one reason that people buy a home in this
School
neighborhood?
districts.
Of course. So people already use their wealth to choose a school, okay? So whether somebody adds money to a voucher, I mean, I don't fight every day for people, I'm sure we agree on this, David. I don't fight every day for people who can already afford to move to that neighborhood or to pay for that private school. I fight for the people who don't have that ability, okay? And in terms of the quality question, it's a very difficult question. You've hit on a very important topic. But go back to your restaurant analogy, which is fantastic. I actually use that too. That's why I was so thrilled to see it in your book. But we don't have restaurant authorizers that come in and shut them down, okay? Now, we do have regulatory accountability because if you don't follow health and safety standards, you should be, if the government's doing its job, you should be shut down. But you made a comment earlier that low-income families, parents, may not have the ability or the information to make a choice. We turned away 70,000 parents last year from our scholarship program who wanted it. They know what they want. And I gave you the stats on whether it's working or not. Now, here's what's so hard, and this gets back to the representative's point. Anytime there's a problem at a private faith-based school serving our scholarship kids, it's on the front page of the newspaper. Anytime. So how do we develop in the public, the general public, the tolerance for isolated failure? Because think about it, if you could only open up a restaurant with a guarantee that it would not shut down, you're not going to have any restaurants. And people say, no, education's different. No, it's not. And Louisiana actually got this wrong with their voucher program because they said, oh no, if you're going to serve voucher kids on this program, you can't take more than 25% of the kids in your school on the voucher. You have to be accredited. If you don't produce certain results within 2 years, you can't serve the kids anymore. So what happened? The better schools said, no thanks, not going to participate. And they've had poor results. In Florida, we had less of that regulatory accountability, and we had really good results. That doesn't mean there aren't some schools in this program that I wish didn't exist. But if I become the czar and decide to shut them down, we're not going to have the innovation and have the wonderful occurrence that I've seen many times over where in Broward, the Florida High School Public School Principal of the Year started a faith-based school, and now it's an oasis of learning in a very low-income neighborhood, 100% graduation rate.
All right,
Real
but
quick.
before we go on, let me just say, we're going into the lightning round, so give me lightning answers, because I got 5 people out here that want to ask a quick question.
Okay, and one thing I just want to mention, and I read David's book, so I knew he wasn't going to agree with me on that. But the diversity that you're talking about, I absolutely appreciate and want to see that same diversity, which is why I'm in research and working with diversity by design, charter schools, and trying to bring those types of ideas into Florida. However, we have a major deficit of diversity of thought in our government-run schools and in schools in general, and diversity of value systems that are being taught to our kids. I have this conversation very often with people who have a problem with funding faith-based schools, and I say to them, if you think that they're not teaching religion in traditional public schools, you are wrong. It's not a religion that worships a deity, but it's a religion in that there are value systems that are being taught to our students in traditional public schools that I, as a parent, may or may not agree with. And it's very monolithic across government-run schools. So that is an issue, I think, that when you're talking about the government running the schools, cannot be ignored. That perhaps in the time periods that you're talking about where you were concerned with diversity of the individuals when it comes to race and income, there was a much more common value system across the culture of our country. And so I didn't send my child to school worrying that they were going to be taught a completely different value system opposite of what I have at home. There was much more cohesion in the value system of the country. That is a major concern for parents now that is perpetuated when the only option is a government-run school system and that faith-based, voucher-based options are not available.
Thank you, Erica. Matt?
This will go right into that same question. So we've talked a lot about the tests and how we increased and improved that. But to your point, culture drives a great deal of this. And so my question really is to the whole committee here is, we talk about measurements for teachers and parents to make an educated decision. Where do we put in culture in that, and what does that look like in that transparency of grading schools or things of that nature? What does that look like in the bigger scope of education in Florida?
And I'm sorry to do this, but I need you to very quickly. Anybody? Adam, you had some.
Thanks. I'm sorry, on the culture measure. I mean, I think that I'll try to be very quick. I mean, I do think that this is an area where I think we need some innovation in looking beyond just assessment scores. I mean, I firmly believe that assessment scores are really valuable and are important, and that that there is a bar by which if a school falls below it, then they should not have the privilege of educating our children. There's be lots of places. But I think there are lots of other measures that are really important as well, and school culture is certainly one of them. How you measure that is really challenging. So I don't have an answer for how you measure, but I do think it's something that we need to continue to think and innovate around.
Neil, you had a question.
I spent maybe half of the last 10 years in child welfare. I certainly agree with people about the lack of fault tolerance among media. But I'd like to go back to Erica's point about the kind of the one from column A, one from column B kind of school selection, and the challenge of parents who have, there's a 30 million word gap. There are all kinds of parents who are not capable or prepared, at least, to make the decisions that a lot of choice decisions require. And I wonder, and I don't mean to be an apologist for monopoly paternalism, but I just wonder how you might address that aspect of choice.
The fact that not every parent will do a great job is not an indictment of choice. And I know you don't mean it that way. I know you don't mean it that way, but many people do. In my experience, income level has, back up, the degree to which a parent is involved in their child's education has not been directly related to household income. There has not been a direct relation. I've seen, last week I was at an event where the governor signed a new program, and one of the speakers was the aunt of 2 young children, very low income, and the mother had passed away 4 months ago, and her dying wish on her deathbed was to get the kids on the scholarship, to get them at this school, which she knew was the right one for her kids. My kids go to a supposedly great private school in Tampa. I've met parents who don't have any idea what's going on with their kids, okay? So I just don't think income is a direct relationship. Your question is a great one. How do you get parents of any income level to get more involved in their children's education? I don't know the answer to that question.
And there are cities that are figuring this out. I mean, if you go to New Orleans or you go to Denver or you go to DC, you'll find that they know this is a problem. And they create centers around the city where parents can go to get more information about the school and more help in making school choice decisions. And in addition, in New Orleans, a nonprofit sprung up that gets paid by big employers, particularly hotels and universities, to help their employees make their school choice decisions and deal with their schools if they have a problem. Really interesting. It's called Ed Navigators. And so we do have to work hard, I think. We have so many immigrants in this country, and we also have families where grandparents are raising children because the parents have checked out for one reason or another. We have some families that are really disadvantaged, and we have to work hard to help them flourish in a choice system. But I do agree with John completely that a choice system is going to get better outcomes for everyone, even if not everyone is making informed choices.
That's a proven.
I got through half my questions, and my time is up. And I want to apologize to Charles, Ray, and Keith. I know you guys wanted to ask, and I apologize for that. But I do want to say to this panel, wow, unbelievable. This is great, and I very much appreciate it. We have some real thought-provoking conversations that needs to take place the rest of this afternoon if you guys are around. I hope that if you have a question, you want to come ask them and so forth. Would you please join me in giving them a great round of applause?